I don't know about you guys, but I have been baking aggressively. Baking all the time. Sourdough is now my life. I am now a baker. But aside from baking, we have been up to not that much. Obviously, we are still not really going outside that much. We have been spending a lot of time as a family, which we are super thankful for. In any other circumstances, we would be back in the Netherlands and both probably back at work. And now we get to watch all of the developmental stages of Cora while she's growing up, and it's been really good. Although it is not amazing all the time to be locked inside with your family. I'm sure lots of people can relate to that. But in all, it's been really nice. Now, if you haven't seen what we've been up to over the last couple of months, then I would advise you to click on the link in the description and you can go and sympathize with past Casey, who had no idea what was going to happen, and you can find out about what we were going to do this year. But instead, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about my first experience living overseas and going to New Zealand to live for the first time, and how I traveled really cheaply in an expensive country. So if you're interested in that, keep on watching and let's get into it. Welcome to my story. Now, I flew into Queenstown just before the winter season was really picking up, and I had $300 in my bank account, my Australian bank account, and I packed a backpack, just like a hiking backpack. Yeah, I just jumped on an aeroplane. I remember like the sense of awe and wonder when you land at the Queenstown airport. If anyone has done it before, leave a comment below about how amazing it is to fly over the Remarkables while they're snow-capped. It is like a sight you've never seen before. It is stunning. And I was so excited, and I was walking across the tarmac just in a new country for the first time all by myself, and I just remember feeling so amazed. I couldn't believe that I had decided to do this, and it felt like the best decision ever. So I jumped on the bus and I headed into town. Now, this wasn't the first time I had been to Queenstown. I had traveled to New Zealand before. My father's actually from New Zealand, so I've got a bit of family there and had been both to the North and the South Island. But it was more on like a tour thing, and I stopped and visited family, and it was all pre-organized before I went. So this was the first time that I'd really thrown myself in the deep end in terms of organizing things as I was going. Now, I walked through town and I asked around at a couple of different hostels what their weekly prices were, what their arrangements were, what dorms were available, anything like that first. And then after I had compared prices and had a look at what was the best option for me, I ended up settling for, what was it? Like, I can remember where it is, what street it was in, but I don't actually remember the name. If I remember the name, I'll leave it in the description below, because they were a fantastic hostel. When I went in 2016, I want to say, they had just opened up, so everything was new, the facilities were new, the bathrooms were immaculate, the kitchen and cooking space was really clean, and obviously the lounge space, nothing had been trashed or used that much. They'd just opened a couple of months before the winter season. So it was a brand new hostel, but it was also charging the same prices as everywhere else in town. So I ended up opting for that one. Now, the thing was, arriving just before winter is that I had in my hand, great, it's perfect season to pick up some work. There'll be lots of people looking for workers, backpackers, that sort of thing. Queenstown in the winter is a really busy season. They've got 2 main ski fields, and they're also really close to Coronet Peak ski field. So to have all of that extra traffic in the area, I thought, great, perfect time to land just before the winter. I'll pick up a job like that. Anyway, it did not happen just like that. I ended up having to compete against hundreds of other backpackers that had exactly the same idea, and a lot of them with more bar experience than I had, more cafe experience than I had had. I was used to retail work at the time, so that's where I was sort of focusing, but I was also really open to things. And so I want to say to you guys that if you are planning on also doing a gap year or moving somewhere or doing seasonal work, be open. Apply for things even if you don't have the experience. All it takes is getting a foot in the door, and as long as you speak to the right person and make a really good first impression, you can get a job doing bar work even though you don't have bar experience. Although I did end up going a completely other direction and working as an au pair. So the first couple of days I did resume drops. Everyone was doing resume drops, and there was this really competitive feeling. No one was hiring unless you had an address. The real estate market in Queenstown is a little bit funny because they've got so many transitional workers and people that fluctuate in the seasons. A lot of companies won't take you on unless you have accommodation first, unless you've got a permanent address organized. And then a lot of places wouldn't rent anywhere if you didn't have income. So there was this really awkward situation of which one comes first, being able to find a job or being able to find a house. And you basically need to tie them up so that you were doing it at the same time. So my word of advice is to be flexible. Again, apply for things that you may think you don't have the experience for. Be open to things. I applied for a range of things. You can use websites like Indeed and Seek. They've been two really good resources. But again, when you're doing resume drops, always speak to the person in charge. Do not hand your resume over to someone who's just a casual worker. It will either get lost, you're reliant on their first impression of you and then how they relay that first impression to their manager. It is easier to speak directly to the manager and know that you've made contact with the right person and that they have met you and they know that you're interested in the position. I also checked backpacker boards, job boards, things like Gumtree. I forget the New Zealand one. It's like, I remember the little logo. Again, I will put this in the description when I come up on it, but checking those sorts of job board places, and that's essentially where I ended up finding my job. So I made contact with a family, and the au pair of the family actually contacted me and said that she was going to be in charge of hiring her replacement. We ended up grabbing a coffee together so that she could get a bit more of a face-to-face feel of my personality and my experience. I had never au paired before. I had worked with kids before. I worked at a swimming pool doing swim lessons during my studies while I was at university. And that was basically the only experience I had had with children. I really played that up. I didn't really love kids at the time, if that's okay to say, but I absolutely fell head over heels in love with the family that I ended up working for. The job that I had ended up being perfect, although it did not start until August. So I had a couple of months where I knew I wasn't going to be working. I was not going to fly back to Australia and then fly back to New Zealand to start work. So I had about 2 months, I think, all up where I was going to have to live off my $300 and then make my way back to Queenstown when the job began. Now, Queenstown was super touristy. It was expensive. It was busy. I couldn't find cheap accommodation for a temporary period of time, about 2 months. So I ended up leaving. And the cheapest way I knew how to do that was to hitchhike. So at this point, yes, I had come back to Queenstown to meet up, and we were going to go hitchhiking together throughout New Zealand and use that as our main mode of transport. Now, just as a quick disclaimer, I have had the most wonderful experiences hitchhiking. I have met some really incredible people. My partner Yessa, when he hitchhiked in New Zealand, it ended up being the guy who hired him, and he had work for over a year that we lived there. And I just wanted to say that be cautious, use your own judgment. Don't get into a car where you feel unsafe. Don't put you in a situation where you feel unsafe. I have traveled and hitchhiked in my own as a female, and I've had no issues, but I just wanted to throw out there, be cautious and don't go and hitchhike because you saw that I did in a video and it was fine for me. So just use your judgment and common sense. Anyway, with that out of the way, we had decided to hitchhike, the two of us together, and the first car we jumped into, we were chatting away, and then she all of a sudden mentions that it's a relocation car, and I had never heard of these before. These are the best. So in New Zealand and Australia, you can get a car that you need to drive back to a certain point, and they basically give you the car for free. So it's a hire car. It is timed, so you can't go on road trip for 2 months, which would have been amazing, but that's not the point. The point is that someone drove the car to Queenstown, they need to get the car back up to Auckland, and no one from Queenstown is driving to Auckland or renting the car again. So they basically let you hire the car for $1 a day, sometimes free, sometimes more, it depends on the company, and there's a lot of different deals, but you drive the car back up to Auckland and you just pay for petrol. Some of the deals even include a free tank of petrol or half price petrol, or that you can reclaim a certain amount of your petrol back if you keep the receipts. But there's heaps of deals, and you can do this both in New Zealand and Australia, I'm sure. So instead of leaving Queenstown, we actually got our first ride to drop us back at the airport. I booked a relocation car online, and then we picked it up an hour later and we were off. And I'm going to insert a couple of photos of the car that we actually had while we were relocating it back up to Auckland. We used the car to get to Milford Sound, and then we drove back to Queenstown, stayed the night, and then left really early again the next morning. So I think we had about 4 days all up to get to Auckland. We drove from Queenstown up to Christchurch, and we stayed with a friend that Yessa had met while he was hitchhiking prior to us meeting up again, and we ended up staying there, and he actually stayed on and didn't come all the way to Auckland and stayed there and worked with them. I went from Christchurch, I left really early that morning, I caught the ferry across with the car, and then I went and stayed with family that I have in Wellington. And then from Wellington, I went to a small beach town where my cousin was actually working in a hostel, and I stayed there a night. And then from there, I dropped the car back off in Auckland, and I actually hitchhiked from Auckland down to Raglan. Now, I'll put a little map in of the places that I went if that's a little bit confusing, and if you don't know where all of those places are in New Zealand. That brings me to another point. So being able to work for your accommodation has been incredibly useful while I was in New Zealand. So I arrived in Auckland, and I decided to hitchhike on my own for the first time down to Raglan, where I had organised to work in a hostel in exchange for food and accommodation. Now, this situation was unique. The person who owned the hostel was a massive stoner slash drug user, and that's fine, you do you. But when I sign up to work and do X amount of hours of work in exchange for accommodation and my food, I expect that to not be 40 plus hours of me being stuck 7 days a week in a house in the middle of nowhere. That was not the agreement, and if it was, I probably would have chosen to do that somewhere else. But having to look after someone's children because they are off doing mushrooms in a field was not necessarily my idea of working for accommodation. So that situation wrapped up really quickly. I visited a couple of places in the surrounding area, and I managed to hitchhike into Raglan a couple of times where my cousin was staying, and I had to get out of there. In the end, the owner of the hostel decided to think that it might be a good idea to send me a message while I was in the next room asking me if we could be more than friends. That was when I decided to leave. Anyway, I contacted my cousin and I said, let's go on a road trip, I'm done. He had secured enough money to buy a van, and we ended up leaving and going on a bit of a road trip up to Mount Maunganui. Now, at this point, my money was getting really low. Although I wasn't giving out massive amounts of money on accommodation and food and travel, I was still running low on my $300, and I had spent my last $100 on, I think it was 2 weeks accommodation at a tiny hostel up in Mount Maunganui. And I remember having a couple of nights at the hostel where I actually didn't have enough money for food. I had obviously prioritized having a roof over my head instead of having food to eat, which was fine. But let me just tell you, the ingredients in the food that gets left behind at hostels, and they put in those little like share bins or like leftover food or left behind food, if you're creative enough, you can survive off that. So there were a couple of nights there when like everyone was making food in the kitchen and me and my cousin would just look at each other and be like, yep, another night without dinner. And these moments at the time feel really heavy and really depressing and very humbling experiences. And in hindsight, they were massively character building and funny now to look back on, that we had gotten to a point where we had run out of money so badly that we couldn't even eat. And I remember waiting on my tax return that was coming back through Australia from working back there for a while, and checking my bank account every single day, seeing if that money was in there, and just like visualizing it and waiting and thinking like when it comes in what I was going to eat and all of those things. And they're great experiences that I've had, and that whole chapter of traveling through New Zealand wouldn't have been the same if I had heaps of money. I had met some of the best people and relied on the generosity of others, and had met heaps of people hitchhiking and people that offer you places to stay, a bed to sleep in, food to eat. And I'm still friends with some of those people now. They've totally made that New Zealand chapter exactly what it was. So the family that I had decided to work for as an au pair had offered to fly me back down from Auckland, and they picked me up at the airport. I had one crossover shift with the current au pair that was still working. She was leaving the following day, so we got up, we ran through what we do in the mornings, what time we start. So I au paired for 4 boys. The boys were aged 6, 9, 10, and 11 at the time that I started au pairing for them. And they were fantastic boys. They took me in straight away, and I know that a lot of people have some pretty intense like horror stories from working as an au pair and working for these terrible families. But after chatting with the mother of the family that I worked for, she said that they've got just as many au pair horror stories, and just having these random people in their house that have no idea what they're doing. But the arrangement that we had was perfect. So I was paid weekly. All of my accommodation was obviously paid for because I was living with them. I had a separate entrance to the house, a separate wing. The house was actually massive. So I had a wing, and I had my own lounge room. I had my own bathroom, and again, my own entrance. I also got use of the car, not only while I was working for them, but it was my car to use on the weekends if I wanted to go anywhere. Obviously, the petrol cost that I had in the weekend was my responsibility, but any of the petrol cost that I used during the week, the family would pay for. And I guess it was just a matter of learning the kids' routines. They were the busiest children I've ever met. They all did a second language, they all played a musical instrument, and they all did after-school tutoring. They all played a different sport. It was hectic, to say the least. I loved working for the family, and it was the perfect arrangement. I was able to subsidize all of my travel costs. During the time that I worked there, I could take time off work and take the car and go on road trips, which we did quite a few times, and we explored and were able to sleep in the back of the ute because I had like the giantest car ever while I worked for them. And we just chuck in some blankets in the back, and then me and Yessa would pick a new place to go, pick a side of the coast, and we would go camping. We had a tent at this point, and we would just do free activities, go camping, walking, rock climbing, all of those things that don't cost a lot of money. We never really went out to eat. We still lived on a budget, but we saw a massive chunk of the country. So I guess this is where my budgeting lifestyle really began, and it wasn't really much of a choice as much as it was a necessity. So I basically gave myself $50 a week, and that was money for me, and I didn't have to spend it every week, but that was the limit of what I wanted to spend. There was free yoga classes being offered in town, so I would usually do a free yoga class on a Sunday morning, and looking around in your community for other things like that as well. I bought a lot of my clothes secondhand, and if I didn't want to put in a full tank of petrol, then I would just hitchhike somewhere. I think a really great way of saving money when you go and visit a location is meeting local people and having those experiences with people that live in the area. They tend to do cheap things. They don't give a lot of money out on the touristy, hyped things. So I worked for the family for over a year, managed to see a lot of the South Island, had the freedom to explore, had a car to do so, and then when I finished up working, I hitchhiked all the way from Queenstown back up to Nelson, and I did a sailing course because that was going to be the idea of me leaving and doing that next. I was going to work on sailboats or cruise ships and that sort of thing. I hitched up to Nelson, had booked my accommodation for the week for the course, and then I hitched back down to Christchurch and stayed with Yessa where he was working at the time, and then flew back from Christchurch back to Australia to stay again with my mum. The people that I hitchhiked with were hilarious. It was such an amazing experience. I ended up hitchhiking with this guy all the way up to Nelson, and he was this farmer. He was called Graham, and he was the funniest person I've ever met. He bought me lunch and we chatted, and he was learning Spanish at the time. He was going overseas for the first time with his wife in a couple of months, and he wanted to be able to order his food in Spanish. So we listened to a podcast Spanish for like 4 hours, and then he confessed that Adele is his favorite singer ever, and then we listened to like all 4 of her albums, and he sang at the top of his lungs. And this was the most unexpected thing I've ever seen, like this full-on Kiwi bloke, dairy farmer, singing Adele at the top of his lungs, driving a hitchhiker down to Nelson. It was too funny, and he was the sweetest man ever. I was telling him about my next adventure, which was going to be the bicycle trip, and he was like, add me on my email and send me all the updates. And I lost the email. I'm so upset about it, but I lost the email. But Graham, thank you. You've made my New Zealand hitchhiking experience the best it could have been. So to summarize, the tips I would give you for traveling cheap in an expensive country are working for your accommodation. You can do this on Workaway, which I think you have to sign up for, or you can directly contact a lot of the hostels and places. Woofing is a great thing. Working on organic farms, I think that stands for. I think, again, you might have to pay to sign up or reply to ads, but you could also directly contact a lot of farms and places like that. Now that is available both in Australia and New Zealand, and I think there's quite a few places now that do it in Asia, but I'll talk about that in the Asia videos that are coming up. Meal planning and eating cheap, not buying a lot of meat. It was probably the first time that I really decided to cut back on my meat consumption and plan out my meals, and getting creative. Using those left behind food bins at hostels are like a gold mine. You can make some pretty delicious and sometimes disgusting meals, but food is food at that point if you don't have the money for it. I know Yessa, when he was living in a share house, he actually went dumpster diving a couple of times, which is illegal in Australia and New Zealand, but you can get some amazing fresh produce that is perfectly edible, and making plenty of meals with that, and use of food that otherwise would have been thrown out. And like I said before, this is probably the beginning of where I really started to be a bit more conscious of my consumption and outgoings and incomings, and living cheap and still having great experiences without having to give out a lot of money. So if you're also interested in my money saving tips, I have a video which will be here somewhere, and you can click on there and see how I save my money and what sort of questions I ask myself before I make a new purchase. Anyway guys, thanks for watching, and I hope that you've learned something about how to be in an expensive country and still travel pretty cheaply. Stay tuned for our next lot of videos, which will be all about Southeast Asia and how we found places to sleep while we were camping, and what cycling was like, and basically how we figured out how to get from Singapore to China and spend as least money as possible. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.